Um, I want to start out by just saying that there are basically whole semesters, as our seminarians can attest, given on Catholic social teaching. So I am going to take this, I've really tried to reduce it to what are the essential tenets of Catholic social teaching, because the whole body of doctrine is a lot, and it's been centuries, and so there are very significant documents in the church that outline or comment on social teaching, and I am going to take the principles of social teaching and elaborate on those a little bit and maybe point out some examples. So, but as always, I wanted to start with Scripture, because we always start with Scripture, or everything is rooted in Scripture, right? So, so in 1 John 4, we have, whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God abides in him and he in God. So we know and believe the love God has for us. God is love. And he who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. In this is love perfected with us, that we may have confidence for the day of judgment, because as he is, so are we in this world. I think the doorbell, somebody said the doorbell.
Someone's out there.
Oh, okay. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and he who fears is not perfected in love. We love because he first loved us. If anyone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he does not love his brother whom he has seen. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, that he who loves God should love his brother also. So basically, the social teaching of the church is important because it's all about how we live our faith and morals in the world. And Catholicism is not a me and God alone kind of faith, just as this scripture passage says. It's basically we're part of families, we're part of communities, we're part of nations, and all of us are connected. So we love our neighbor as ourselves. It's rooted, Catholic social teaching is rooted in the fact that we are created in God's image, and that each of us has the same dignity, which then obliges us to love, calls us to love each other and practice justice towards our neighbors. So as this says just in verse 21 here, 20 and 21, love of neighbor, Jesus taught us that love of neighbor is inseparable from the love of God. We can't say that we love God and hate our neighbor at the same time. It just doesn't work that way. So that's basically the background of where a lot of the social doctrine is developed from, the starting point. It's defined in two ways. More broadly, Catholic social teaching is all the ideas and the theories we have developed over the entire history of the church on all the issues having to do with social life, right? So it's always developing as the world changes. It also refers more specifically to the body of teachings written in the modern era in response to political, economic, and social issues that are happening in our time. So, for example, the first social document in the that's considered in the modern social teaching is it's called Rerum Novarum, which is also in English, it's on the conditions of labor, and it was issued by Pope Leo XIII in 1891 in response to some of the problems arising from the Industrial Revolution. And in this document, the Pope touches on the importance of protecting private property, on just wages for workers, on protection of the poor and the oppressed, and on the importance of the family unit. So that document is almost like the foundation of modern Catholic social teaching. And there have been a number of other documents following that, but that's well known that's a very well-known document. So throughout the modern era, various world influences have prompted the church to respond to help us understand how to be Christians in an ever-changing world. So even, for example, in Caritas in Veritate, the Love in Truth, which was a document issued by Pope Benedict, was maybe 4 years ago. Do you guys, anybody remember offhand? I forget exactly the date, but maybe about 4 years ago. And that touches even on some of the issues of technology, how technology affects our modern social life, and how that he works in technology into Catholic social teaching and an approach to it. There is no official list of documents, of Catholic social teaching documents. You know, it's not like there's the official books of the Bible. It's not like the official list of Catholic social teaching documents. But there's a general consensus as to which ones fall in the category of social teaching. There's another book which I forgot to bring with me this morning, called The Compendium of Catholic Social Teaching. And it's a great book because it summarizes, it was published in 2005, and it just summarizes a lot of the documents and a lot of the history, and a lot of the history behind the documents. So why Rerum Novarum was published at that time during the Industrial Revolution, what Pope Leo XIII in particular was responding to, things like that. So it's a great volume to have. All the main, I also had a handout for you with all the main documents, which I also left at home. So I'll try to bring that next week. I just left it before this morning, and I forgot to, I had printed it out and I forgot to reprint it out. So I wanted to highlight some of the principles and the most important principles of Catholic social teaching. So again, this is sort of a Catholic social teaching in the abridged version, all right? There are two main themes that run through all of Catholic social teaching. First is that each person has inherent dignity and worth. And we touched on that also last week with Humanae Vitae, which is one of the examples I'll use coming up. And second is what we just read, no man is an island, right? Everybody's connected, and we're connected to each other and responsible for each other. So nobody's completely autonomous, and we all look out for each other. There are also different ways to break down the major themes of Catholic social teaching. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops breaks it down into about 8. I'm going to cover about 6 of the main ones here. So the first, human dignity. This is the foundation. This is almost like the cornerstone. It's the foundation on which all the others are based. So all human life is sacred. Every person has an inherent dignity and an immeasurable worth. So our dignity is the starting point for everything else. So last week we talked a little bit about Humanae Vitae, which was issued in 1968 on human life, or of human life, rather. And that reaffirmed the Church's teaching on life, on the inherent and inviolable dignity of each human person beginning at the moment of conception. So that it's almost like that is a cornerstone, that's a foundation for church teaching and for human dignity. In our society today, as we all know, life is directly under attack, and in many levels. You know, it's from abortion, euthanasia, certain kinds of fertility treatments, embryonic stem cell research, all kinds of things, death penalty, threats of cloning, all kinds of things threaten the dignity of human life. And we're called, as Christians and as Catholic Christians, to respond to these in a way and to understand why and how the church understands the person, the inherent and inviolable dignity of every human person, every human life. Catholic teaching also calls us to avoid war. I mean, there's a whole body of doctrine on just war theory. What is just war? Now that, I won't go into that, because that's one of those, you can elaborate on that for a long time. But again, nations ought to protect the right to life by finding ways to resolve conflicts peacefully as much as possible. It's not always possible, but as much as possible. As Catholics, as I just mentioned, we also believe every person is precious and that people are more important than things. And so we uphold that human dignity. So that's sort of the first foundation, is human dignity. Second principle is the common good. How many of you have heard the term the common good? Yeah? Okay. So the common good in Catholic social teaching really refers to the conditions that allow each of us to be fulfilled and to realize our potential. Everyone has a responsibility to contribute to the good of everyone. That's basically what is meant by the common good. We're social beings, so our dignity and purpose can only be realized in relationship to others. So how we organize our society, in economics, politics, law, and policy directly affects our dignity and the health of our communities. An important part of the common good is the Church's preferential option for the poor. So I don't know if many of you have heard that, but it's basically the Church, following Christ, is always concerned with the needs of the poor and vulnerable. And so just as Christ said, the poor will always be with us. But it's almost like a moral test of society of how they treat their most vulnerable. And deprivations and problems of the poor wound and affect the entire community. So we're called to at least look at how laws and policy decisions, as well as our own actions, affect the lives of the poor. So that's one aspect of achieving. That's just one aspect of achieving the common good. So a practical outreach to that is even the poor box in the back of the church. That's one way of looking out for the poor. The food that people leave behind. Those are looking out for the common good, and how do we treat the most vulnerable, and how do we treat those who have needs that they can't take care of on their own. Those sorts of things. So those are sort of just two very practical examples that I'm sure you're all familiar with. Third principle, the universal destination of goods. So this is really kind of one of the more interesting principles to think about. It teaches that all people must have access to the things they need to live and to thrive. So the universal destination of goods is rooted, again, in the fact that God created the earth and all of its resources for the entire human race without excluding or favoring anyone. So we are basically called to be stewards of creation, of all that God has given us. So it's also a principle about stewardship. It obliges us to consider how the goods we have, how we exercise stewardship over the goods that we have. So much goes back to this whole idea of gift that we've spoken about a number of times. So basically all of creation is a gift. It's God's gift to mankind, and all that we have, all of our possessions, our money, our land, are how do we use those things that we have? Do we use them? It's just something that each of us, we have to reflect on and think about. How do we use just the many things that we've been given, the gifts that we have been given personally, but our talents? How do we use the gifts of our time? How do we use our material goods that we either earn or receive as gifts? And that's what stewardship is about. Here we also find that the church is called to treat the earth as a gift, to properly care for the earth, to creation itself, excuse me. Didn't mean to answer that, I meant to shut my phone off. Anyway, so that's, how do we care for the creation around us, and that's stewardship over creation. Sometimes I think, and the church talks about this too, but it's kind of interesting. It's almost a reflection of how we treat creation when we. I'm not pointing finger. I don't mean to point fingers at anyone here, because everyone maybe drops paper or trash on the ground inadvertently sometimes, or things like that. But when you go and you see there are areas where people just dump all of their trash, that's a real, it's almost a degradation of the gift of creation, of that earth that God has given us to care for. So it's really, that's just one example of how do we care for these things. Fourth principle is subsidiarity. So the principle of subsidiarity is also a really interesting principle. This holds that the functions of government should be performed at the lowest level as possible, and as long as they can be performed adequately. So when the needs in question can't adequately be met at a lower level, then higher levels of government should intervene. So again, this is based on the importance of the family and local community to determine and meet the needs of its own members, free of coercion or control from larger governing units. So one example of this might be in some communities, and not necessarily here, but there's been a debate, and not so much now because I think it's more accepted, say over homeschooling. Should parents be allowed to educate their children at home, or should they be forced to attend a school? So where do we, if that's proper exercise of their parental rights, their duties, and if they're receiving the proper education, then what does the government have a right to step in and say, no, your children must attend a school? So that would be an example, and I don't think that happens anywhere anymore. But just to what extent should government control all sorts of things in society? So it's another interesting question to consider. The church does hold the state should be an instrument in promoting human dignity, protecting human rights, and building a common good. And all people have a right and a responsibility to participate in political institutions so that the government can achieve its proper role and goals, and so that we are also exercising our own responsibility in government. So that's basically subsidiarity. And that doesn't mean that everybody has to run for office. It might just mean voting, on that kind of thing, or taking an interest in what's happening and understanding what's at stake. Fifth is participation. So all people have a right to participate in the economic, political, and cultural life of society. And it's not just that all people be able to participate in the community on some level. It's morally wrong for a person or group to be excluded unfairly, or to be unable to participate in the society in which she or he lives. So it's race discrimination, excluding someone on the basis of their skin color is wrong, because it's not allowing them. We all share the same dignity, no matter what race or ethnicity or anything else we are born into. That's part of the gift that God has given us, right? Each person. And the sixth one, did that make sense? What I just said, yeah? Okay. The sixth one is solidarity. So solidarity basically says we are all one human family. Our responsibilities to each other cross national, racial, economic, ideological differences, and we're called to work together globally for justice for all of our brothers and sisters. So the idea is that real development is always fully human, and it's not enough, nor even helpful, to just treat problems superficially, to just put a Band-Aid on certain problems and not actually to help improve the situation or improve what needs to be made right. So we are always called to respect the moral, cultural, spiritual dimensions of the person, of the human person. So solidarity essentially is like acting like we're all we're all part of one big human family, and we're responsible to pray and to work for the betterment of our human family. Those are the 6 principles that I thought I would touch on because you hear them most often, and they pretty much touch on everything. Catholic social teaching really involves the complex social matters within all teaching documents and all different sorts of teaching and all different levels of authority. So Catholic social teaching gives us non-negotiable principles for our life in the world, the ones that we just outlined. But the application, so how we apply these principles, really requires judgment, and it requires the exercise of our own judgment. And so it's not equivalent to the doctrine itself. The exercise, how we understand and exercise these principles essentially boils down to how each one of you incorporates it into your own lives. So for example, when the church states in our social teaching that we have a duty to care for the poor, it wouldn't necessarily be in line with Catholic social teaching to say, well, the church doesn't teach that she has a duty to care for the poor. But we might disagree on which policies are best to help the poor. So it doesn't dictate which policies are best to help the poor. Does that make sense? That distinction? Yeah? Okay. A good example, and this is just one I pulled out, would be a good example of distinguishing between different levels of Catholic social teaching would be the American Bishops' letter on War and Peace. And they say, not every statement in this letter has the same moral authority. So they say that. It would be nice if all the documents made these distinctions clear or identified which claims fit into which category, but that's not necessarily the case. So it really requires a lot of studying and reading and understanding the church's, understanding the basic principles and what is being said about these, what the church is saying about different things. One of the things that I find interesting, and we talked about solidarity, we talked about universal destination of goods, is in the last encyclical, In Caritas in Veritate, Truth in Love and Truth by Pope Benedict, he talked about rights and duties. So what are rights and what are our duties? And he basically says, this is a quote from Benedict, he says, an overemphasis on rights leads to a disregard for duties. So Catholic social teaching has always embraced human rights. It's always embraced a long list of rights. But there's debate as to Benedict didn't enumerate a list of rights, but basically what he was saying, duties set a limit on rights because they point to the anthropological and ethical framework of which rights are a part. In this way, ensuring that they do not become license. So basically, he was just reminding people that there's a balance between rights and duties. You know, basically, just as there's a balance between love and responsibility. So there's a balance in these things, and he was calling people to be aware of not only what their rights are, but also what their duties are, and in relation to those rights. And those were, it's again, not enumerating what the church must, what you must believe, say, with regard to immigration, but it's reminding people that these are some principles to keep in mind and to consider. So that's sort of, again, a lot of information. So if there are just two things that you remember about Catholic social teaching, first is human dignity is the foundation of it all, and that we're called to promote the common good. So, practically speaking, how can we live the social teachings of the church, and how can we understand this a little bit more for ourselves? The compendium is a great way to understand it. I think I might even have an extra copy at home, so I can bring that in and I can leave it in the back so people can look at that and look at the different writings that are in there. Give some thought to what you do for the poor. Not necessarily just the homeless, the unemployed, not necessarily those people, but just those people, but any needy person or group. It could be, it could be anyone. So here's an example. I have a practicum. So one day a week, I'm in a high school, and most of the kids in these high school, they're not starving. They have the clothes that they need, but some of them are. They can't. It's difficult for me to grasp how many stepfathers they have, and they're very poor in other ways. There's no basic grounding or stability, so they don't have stable home environments, and that's a kind of a poverty. So that's just an example. The poor, not just necessarily the people at my sister's place, but there are all kinds of poor and needy around us. So it's just a call to reflect on who are the poor in your midst, and how do you approach the poor. Thinking about how we participate in our neighborhoods, our cities, our nation. How do we understand some of the more critical parts of public policy? I'm kind of giggling there because I was watching, I just saw a flash in the news, and they were talking about outlawing swearing in the city of Baltimore, and I thought that was just kind of humorous. So my thought was they should just take care of jaywalking first, and then anyway, attacks on human life and human dignity in our own country. Is there anything that we can do to protect, defend, and promote human life and dignity? And then, how do we treat our possessions? How are we stewards over our possessions? How do we care for the resources that we have, for natural resources, for all of those things, our time, talent, treasure that I mentioned before? And then, just thinking on all of these things, how are other ways that you might live out Catholic social teaching? Any questions? That was a lot to pack in.
You say there were 8